Do you fully understand the clitoral complex, or as my guest today calls it, your unique pars intima? I recently saw a truly incredible video, The Anatomy of the Clitoris, Learn Integral Anatomy with Gil Hedley. As soon as I saw it, I smiled because I met Gil many years ago when he was having children in my childbirth class. And then I trained his sister as a doula and have loved following her as she's become a midwife. And even Gil's mother trained as a postpartum doula with me and worked together with me for several years. So now, years later, to see his work so well describe the clitoris in his words, a beautiful gift and blessing of the clitoris, I knew I had to reach out to invite him to join us to share with you all his thoughts about the clitoris and any thoughts about the role it may play in labor and birth. Hi, I'm Deborah Pascali-Bonaro, founder and director of OrgasmicBirth and host of the OrgasmicBirth podcast. My guest, Gil Hedley, PhD, has been teaching integral anatomy in the dissection laboratory via keynotes and speaking tours and online via his extensive website and subscription portal at www.gilhedley.com. Since 1995, he is producer of the Integral Anatomy series, the Anatomy from A to Z Project, and the Nerve Project, as well as being the author of several books and anatomy models. He is based at the Institute for Anatomical Research in Colorado Springs, Colorado, where he teaches, films, and serves as board president. Welcome, Gil.
Thank you, Deborah. It's great to be here with you.
Well, it is such an honor to reconnect with you after all these years and see all that you're doing. And I have to just ask, can you tell me what motivated you to create that video?
Well, I very early on in my dissection career realized I knew nothing about the clitoris. I mean, I had an 8th grader's knowledge of the clitoris, and that I was interested in it because it's such a precious and important part of human experience and human anatomy. And so I made an effort very early on to start looking up, pictures and seeing if I could find how I could dissect that structure. And they were very rare, a decent dissection image. And there was a book that I loved at that time, this is 30 years ago, called the Color Atlas of Anatomy. This is not the coloring book that many people are forced to color into. Color Atlas means a dissection atlas, basically dissection imagery. There was one picture in this atlas of this odd little wishbone on a piece of black felt. And I was like, and it was like clitoris. And I was like, what? No way, a wishbone, that's so cool. And so I spent several years just practicing dissecting it until I could show that sort of wishbone shape. Basically the glands, the shaft, and the crura, or the legs. So I learned how to dissect that. And then over the years, I did that hundreds of times, and for classes to teach people about the clitoris. Among other things in my class, of course, it wasn't the only thing I was doing, but it was always part of the show, as it were, to share that amazing structure. And then more books started coming out years later, maybe the last 10 years or so, written mostly by women who were trying to give, more press time to the clitoris. And I admired their efforts and read their books and saw in these books many images that included this formation, the vestibular bulbs, it was called. And of course, these are graphical drawings, not dissections. The human body, when it comes to the actual tissues on the table, is very different than what pretty drawings people can draw. And so people were drawing these little saddlebag balloons along with the crus and the shaft and the glands of the clitoris. And I thought, well, it must be there. They wouldn't be drawing it. So where is it? I've been looking at this thing for a long time. And what it turned out was that they were hiding beneath some muscle tissue, the bulbospongiosus muscle that I was very fond of showing people. So I would show people that muscle tissue, and that'd be the end of the story there. But it turns out I just needed to dissect further. So I dissected beyond that muscle tissue. And sure enough, there were the vestibular bulbs. Well, now the picture got even bigger on the table, and I could be much more demonstrative about the actual sort of more of the totality of the complexity of the structure there. And again, it's like, it really depends on the anatomist or the author who's talking exactly how many tissues they want to include in the organ that we can call the clitoris. And well, you could say the same thing about the brain too. The brain's got a lot of different shapes and parts to it. And where are you going to draw the line? Where's the brain end? Most people will say, well, it definitely ends when you're not in the skull anymore. But is it all the brain, or is that the brain stem? Is that the brain? So the same thing with the clitoris. It's like, well, is that included? Is that included? So I leave people to their own choices as to what they want to include, but I just show all the tissues as best as I can.
So I have to say, in like looking at your work, and then I encourage everybody, we'll put the link to the video in the show notes to watch it. I find it really shocking that most medical providers, especially obstetricians, nurses, and midwives, don't learn about the anatomy of the clitoris in their training, nor do they consider any role that it might play in childbirth. Why is this not included? Why do you think it's not in medical text?
Well, the clitoris is rediscovered along with something like the enteric nervous system, which was in the textbooks in the 1900s and then eliminated. Why? I don't know. They changed the curriculum. It wasn't enough time. They didn't feel like it, or they were afraid. They didn't want to talk about it because they were ashamed of themselves, or they just didn't understand it. But the clitoris was known and well described centuries ago, and it just kind of got forgotten. And I think it was intentionally forgotten in the process of literally destroying it under the Victorians and the Protestant moralists of the 19th centuries, who simultaneously were promoting circumcision. So circumcision and clitoral cauterization were actually, sort of medico-moral procedures that were advocated by the Protestant moralists of the 18th and 19th centuries and the Victorians in their effort to suppress what they considered to be that devil of sexuality. So the body was very much put aside and even punished in its pleasures by means of circumcision and clitoral cauterization. Now, fortunately, clitorectomies and this sort of attack on the pars intima that was waged in those periods is now illegal in I don't know, 37 states at least, thank goodness. But circumcision remains the norm and the most common surgical procedure in America. So the thing is, I think it wasn't only forgotten, I think it was actively suppressed and repressed as part of a cultural time period whose legacy lives on in our current culture. So that ignorance, I think, was strategic, actually.
And that's interesting to hear, because not only does it impact people with clitorises in their entire life, but certainly with childbirth. I don't know if you heard, but in our episode 26, Margaret Jowett discussed her theory about the role of the clitoris in labor. And I'm wondering if you've considered that and what some of your thoughts might be.
Well, I do personally tend to resist some statements that are often made about the clitoris, that this is the only human organ known to us that's there exclusively for pleasure. And I think to myself, I've seen every tissue of the body, literally, hundreds and hundreds of times, put my hands on them, dug them out, cut them apart, looked inside of them. There's nothing in our body that is of single purpose. Everything is multi-purposed, and it's beautiful. It's incredible, actually, how multi-purpose. I mean, they'll say the liver has 500 functions. Well, we're going to tell me that the clitoris has got one function? That seems ridiculous to me. So I'm more on board, or lean into those who would ponder the many possible roles that the clitoris may play in our lives in addition to pleasure. It's obviously for pleasure, because it clearly seems to feel good
Yes.
if you've got one on a good day, at least, I mean, they can also, just like a penis can be in pain, a clitoris can be in pain. You can have adhesions and all kinds of problems, of course. But for the most part, operating as directed, the clitoris appears to definitely have a major role in the experience of pleasure. But also, like, maybe we can think a little deeper about, what kind of programming we have. I mean, I love your title of your podcast, Orgasmic Birth, which I know is not the rule, but it doesn't mean it couldn't be. In other words, it seems to
for
me
sure.
that the biblical, injunction that childbearing shall happen in pain, it seems more of a curse to me. Now, when our subconscious minds adopt a curse, literally with the emotional power of that, then it's not surprising that people do give birth in pain and suffering. But when you have a title like Orgasmic Birth, well, that sort of gets the subconscious mind enkindled with a new idea. And when you, okay, let me hack away at Freud for a minute here. I'm not the biggest Freud fan.
Please do.
I have friends who are huge Freudian fans. But for me, like Freud made, and he was a Victorian, okay? He was from that era, and I don't think he'd quite straightened out his sex mind, to be honest. And I'm no Freudian expert or anything like that, but I can say that the distinction that he made, where, for instance, a clitoral orgasm was considered like a juvenile or an infantile phenomenon, and a vaginal orgasm was considered to be the mature representation of an orgasm, to me is the most flatly absurd thing you could possibly say, anatomically speaking, even, because when you do witness the entire structure of the clitoris, you realize that there's only a clitoral orgasm, and that for instance, the urethral sponge, which is also part of the complex structure that I'm describing, the urethral sponge, which is kind of the anterior wall of the vagina, if you were, say, standing up, if you're having penetration and you have in your particular endowment, especially enriched nervous complement of what I call the delectatal nerve there, then you're going to orgasm from stimulation from that. If your clitoris is more proximate to the opening of the vagina, you'll orgasm from penetration. If your clitoris is less proximate to the opening of the vagina, you'll more likely orgasm from manual stimulation or oral stimulation. So where you have an orgasm in your clitoris is variable from person to person. I have worked with many, many cadavers. If you can look with the anus of a cadaver and look at the position of the rectum relative to the base of the clitoris or the urethral sponge, it's clear that some people will be poked directly with anal penetration in their clitoris. It's not that the anus is being stimulated, which can be, but it's more about how the 100 roads to the clitoris. Basically. And perhaps one of those roads is a baby's head coming out the road, right? So if your baby's head is moving in and out, at the base of the clitoris, and your legs are spread open and you're screaming, why wouldn't that scream possibly be for pleasure rather than for pain? It seems like a perfectly legitimate option to me. And given that the whole complex is really designed to enjoy pressure, not so much as friction, then what greater pressure does a woman endure? A birthing in the birthing moment than the pressure of the head of the baby on the clitoris. So woo, I wouldn't know. Here I am describing something that I've witnessed several times in my own home.
Yes.
But it's not my physical experience. I can't speak to it, but I can speak to the anatomy and say, well, the position is there, for internal pressure on the urethral sponge and the base of the clitoris. Some people enjoy a stretching feeling. It's, again, our pleasure orientations are very varied. I like to distinguish between habituation to a pleasure pattern and then the actual pleasure potential of the particular endowment of a given person. So in other words, if you're whatever, 7 years old and you're masturbating yourself on your stuffed animals, you're going to have a pattern. Maybe you like to be face down, maybe you like to be face up, whatever that pattern is in your childhood exploration of self-pleasuring, often will carry on for your whole life. In other words, that's just what you do, and you might not be even into exploring beyond that, and that's your pattern. But your actual nervous endowment can be very distinct from whatever you figured out when you were 5 or 7 or 12 or 13 or 15 or 16 or what have you. So it may be that birth itself, might for a given individual be the most orgasmic thing they run into. I mean, I had a woman in my class, we were talking about whatever, pierced nipples, and she said, I had the most powerful orgasm in my life when my nipple was pierced. I said, what happened when the other one was pierced? She said, it was the most painful thing I'd ever experienced in my life. So you can't call it really.
Right.
But I do feel like those factors, of differential nerve distribution, a person's habituation to pleasure, and a person's pleasure potential are all factors that play into the way in which a person may be stimulated by the birth process.
I really appreciate you bringing in all those different facets. And I would just like to add one more. I think that in most of our hospital birth, we're literally putting people down, right, onto their back. And wouldn't position play a role, because getting that pressure into that clitoral complex, wouldn't that need to be what most people would do on their own when they're left alone, is lean forward? Do you see a difference there?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think there's a single element of our establishment birth practices that lend themselves towards birth, actually. No less orgasmic birth. So there's no lack of inhibitory mechanisms. I mean, unless you're into public sex, which is right, because because this is the situation. Not many people are really into public birth, actually, because it is kind of close to public sex, and most people are inhibited by that rather than unleashed. I mean, there are exhibitionists among us, but in general, I would say most people are inhibited by the hospital experience, both with respect to birth and pleasure.
Yes.
How many times does a doctor invite a partner to, pleasure their birthing partner? Probably not often.
Right. No, we're leaving pleasure off the agenda in birth. That's why we're here, right? To reclaim it and talk about it. And with that, I have just, it's going great, right? And you're a part of that. I think we're really helping people look at their bodies, their anatomy, the process, their beliefs in a different way. And I'm all about relanguaging. And you just kind of briefly mentioned that you have a new word, the how do you say delectalo?
The delectatal. It's a Latin word, because anatomists love Latin words and Greek words. And so whenever I'm making up a new anatomy word, I always make sure at least I get it in the right language that will be acceptable. But pudendal has a fraught history. It goes way, way back. We're talking way back to the, this sense of shame around the, our sexuality and our sexual anatomy. And I'm tired of saying the word. I'm like, why do I keep repeating this word? I did this when I was a churchgoer, and this is a long time ago, when I'd go to church and have to say, I'm not worthy, over and over again. Every Sunday I'd have to say I'm not worthy. I'm like, well, isn't the whole point of this to make me worthy? I'm feeling unclear here. It seems like a conflict, a tension in my soul to pronounce my unworthiness. Words are very powerful, in the midst of what's supposed to be a blessing towards worthiness. So similarly with the language of anatomy, when we embrace words whose essential meanings are negative, then we're branding ourselves with that negative energy. And I feel like anatomists are not going to get around to it. They're wedded to their tradition. I mean, thank goodness it's not just like Mr. Smith's button or something like that, which it could very well have been called, or more like Luigi's button, because there's a lot of Italian names around our body. But the naming by name is receding. We're taking the surnames out of the body and identifying things more particularly. But I'd like to take that a little further and take out these words that are really associated with cultural baggage with respect to what we're naming, that have really nothing to do with the actual structures, their positions, their shapes, their relative position relative to each other, which is usually how anatomy words are named. Something is major, something must be minor. If there's something anterior, there's something inferior or posterior. If there's something superior, inferior, etc., like that. So why are we using words like parts of shame to describe our sexual anatomy? So that's why I like pars intima. I like that because it emphasizes the intimate aspect of our sexual nature rather than its generative aspect, which again is more of that cultural baggage and religious legacy. Nothing against religions. I've been part of religions. So, however, we don't need to be stuck in our religion. We don't need to be stuck in our anatomy. We don't need to be branding our own bodies negatively every time we pronounce the correct anatomical words. So delectatal I love because it basically means delightful. So instead of pudendum, meaning shameful, we can say delectatum, meaning delightful, or having to do with delight. So yeah, delectatal nerve, artery, vein, that works for me.
I love it. When I heard you say that in your video, I just lit up because I agree with you. The words we use so often bring us to shame and in childbirth, pain as well. So we have really a language that's negative. So when you think about orgasmic birth, and you thought about coming on the podcast and with your wealth of understanding of anatomy, what would you recommend to someone that's listening right now that may either be pregnant or thinking about becoming pregnant, or a partner? What would you say are important aspects to consider to prepare for birth?
Well, with respect to your theme here, which I treasure, don't expect birth to give you an orgasm if you don't know how to give yourself an orgasm, right? In other words,
Right.
so you have to be in a positive and uplifting relationship with your own body in advance of that experience. If you want to have a different experience. In other words, if you are accustomed to pain in your body in every way and consider that to be a value, expect some more pain coming, right? In other words, that's your preparation. In other words, so many of us are married to the concept of suffering as salvific, right? This is in the way of a different experience, right? Suffering theoretically was covered. That's right. In other words, we got that down. Everybody is in our culture is more than happy to listen to you talk about your suffering some more, and that gives them a chance to talk about their suffering. We can all suffer together. Well, that's one model of living, and I'm going to pass on a hard pass. I was there, I did that, been there, done that. So how about we allow ourselves to enter into a positive relationship with pleasure? I don't mean a little pleasure, but a lot of pleasure, because our bodies are friggin' designed for massive amounts of pleasure, actually, more so than we even imagine, and even beyond our sex function. In other words, our spiritual function is pleasurable. So it's not to say, I'm calling y'all to, a life of genital pleasure and hedonism. It's to say that in our culture, we'll react to the very first instance of pleasure in our commitment to pain and our belief that suffering is salvific. So the shift has to be towards an admission that part of the gift of the human body that we've been granted in a mortal life, in an incarnation as we experience it, is that we are built for pleasure. And we may have a lot of cultural baggage around that pleasure, and you may have a lot of cultural baggage as you enter into, say, a birthing experience for yourself. So you have to give time to inspect your beliefs around pleasure if you want to have a different experience of birth.
Thank you. I agree 100%. So well said, Gil. So is there anything else from the work that you're doing that you'd like to share with people that are preparing for birth about their body, about their part intima?
I would say that you literally have to go into a thought bubble, because if you're just watching comedies about delivery and the hysteria of the birthing event, you'll get the wrong message. The message should be, and I offer this message to you, you are beautifully and perfectly designed for exquisite expression of human form in birthing, and that you shouldn't, there's no need to doubt your perfect competence to birthing, and your self-permission to a ecstatic experience of it, a mystical experience, a spiritual experience, which doesn't exclude the pleasures of the body. It's all one grand, beautiful picture. And so I would just encourage people to, I mean, I don't know who published it or who wrote it, but What to Expect What You're Expecting, throw that book in the garbage can. I've never seen a more toxic list of things to fear than in that book. And that there's a different way to look at your potential experience and to create a positive expectation for your experience, because that's what you'll get, a beautiful, positive experience.
Thank you, Gil. Such wonderful words of wisdom. And I know many people are going to want to follow you. How can they learn more, see your videos, join your courses? Can you tell us where people can find you?
Type gilhedley.com and misspell it, and you'll still get to me eventually. So just my name, Gilhedley. I have a bottomless website with a whole lot of stuff on there. Lots of free stuff. If you just want to learn about your body in general. I have a Easy Rider membership. And inside of that free membership, there's a little course called Exploring Pars Intima Models. So in that, I do a dissection of a clay model that I built, because that's a little more tolerable for most people. So I built a beautiful clay model, and then I dissect it on camera in a conversation I have with a dear friend, Sue Hitzman, who's my guest on that particular episode. And then if you want to dive deeper and actually see dissection anatomy with regard to these aspects, it's up on my website as well, but in the paid membership subscription. Also, I have a bottomless YouTube channel as well. I have so much free stuff on the web. You could literally spend many hours just, like, I don't know, probably 30 hours just watching free stuff. That's a lot of time. That's like a couple of seasons of a good show. But yeah, if you go to my YouTube channel, Somonaut, or just type Gil Hedley or Somonaut on YouTube, you'll come up with my channel. And there's, I don't know, now 60, 70 videos up there, including this one that Deborah has kindly mentioned with respect to the clitoris, which I think has about 70,000 views as of now. People just keep watching this video. And it's interesting because I have a video called The Amazing Foreskin that's rapidly catching up to the clitoris. So eventually they'll meet and make love together on my YouTube channel. So.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Gil. For everyone that's listening, we'd love to hear your takeaways. What was your favorite part? We hope that you'll respond, write us back, and stay tuned for the next episode of the Orgasmic Birth Podcast. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah.